I'm Ron, and this is Pascal. And this time we'll be presenting a shocking discovery of the actual golden calf forms at the actual forge. Yes, the second commandment violation, starring the image makers and shakers of Golden Calf Hill. And the second commandment violation, dog is hungry. In Hebrew, it sort of looks like this. And it sort of looks like this in the Greek, with these green items meaning not, and these yellow highlighted items meaning carved image. Idol? Okay. So, ESV, of course, is you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. And there's the second commandment for you. How's that for some clip art? Not entirely accurate, as we will see. So, as a brief prologue, not long after this recent adventure, a lifetime with my wife, I decided to write this treatise about the golden calf altar. My very first treatise of this Arabian adventure. A treatise that I disseminated to a few friends afterwards, a few fellow adventurers, a treatise concerning certain artifacts found in Saudi Arabia, of all places. A preliminary treatise before making a few solid translations of Paleo-Hebrew, yes, Proto-Hebrew, inscriptions that I also found there. A somber treatise that is far from speculative, just as my later translations are far from speculative, since the odds weigh heavily in my favor. Translations proving an enormous Hebrew exodus from Egypt, and a massive passage through a massive Red Sea, proving this very location as the actual Mount Sinai, proving it with more than 1,000,000 to 1 probability. Yeah, how is that for heavy weighting, huh? So, you should find it not at all surprising that this altar was also found there. A dissenting altar near the base of the actual Mount Sinai, or what is commonly called an altar anyway. An altar where sacrifices had been made, gold sacrifices and soul sacrifices. An altar not terribly far from the larger and more elevated altar of Moses. A later built altar where blood sacrifices would be made. Now, which would you rather offer or have offered for your soul? Blood or bloody gold? The blood of a sinless man or Egyptian blood money? But it is this proximity effect that was largely fundamental in convincing me of this particular site. Before even going there, before discovering all that supplementary evidence on site, this artifact was what I came to see. An artifact fully convincing me of this much disparaged location, a site that I had personally disparaged a couple of years earlier. Disparaged in an exegetical message delivered to my Sunday school class, critiquing the wild and wily claims of a certain Ron Wyatt. Silly me. But as they say, sometimes you just have to eat crow or croak, or eat non-halal camel or die, since dying for the truth is a whole lot better than dying for a lie. Not that I needed that above biblical account validated for my own personal faith. No, I was far beyond any crisis of that sort, and was fully committed to the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy and Infallibility. No, I was far beyond any midlife crisis, having lost my wife and kids in a home a couple of decades earlier on account of the way, the truth, and the life. So, no big loss, not compared to the truth. So, I was more than willing to die for my faith, die for that biblical truth. So, I suppose you could say this adventure of a lifetime was a divine calling for us, for me and my present wife, though a clearly inaudible calling. Not an Elijah moment by any means, not an alleged still small voice. No, my God speaks a great deal louder than that. And my God is hardly still. With his irresistible word blaring out like a megaphone, and with his spirit, irresistible, turning the spirit of my reluctant wife, and hopefully turning your spirit as well here. So it was incumbent upon me to write this bold treatise about this alleged altar, since I had to make amends for earlier comments. I had to do penance, you might even say, as if that were even possible. But even more so, to write this treatise, since I happen to have a good deal of experience with melting metals. And not only that, but a great deal of experience working on industrial burners and smelters, holding certificates in gas, oil, and even wood burning, along with numerous welding certificates. So hiding this intimate knowledge would be disingenuous of me. Would be hiding the revealed truth. The truth revealed to this tool for some mysterious reason. With me knowing that behind this alleged altar was actually a smelter. A fully operative smelter in order to fabricate this idol of discontent. With likely a more conventional altar being located somewhere in front of the smelter. A platform of waist-high construction where other items might be prepared and burned. Items containing blood. But an altar that is not so apparent anymore. An altar likely trashed long ago. Trashed right after that idol was trashed. As they say, first things first. Yet that smelter still remains. Those massive boulders yet remain. They remain as a bold reminder. A reminder of a brazen unfaithfulness. A reminder of bowing down and serving. An image of man's imagination. Here's that compound, the Golden Calf Smelter compound. Back in 2022. And here, funnily enough, is a sign. A picture of the sign I took back in 2021, October, where it actually says violators. So, what was the actual violation? Now, according to the biblical account, this was an altar upon which a great many burnt offerings and peace offerings were made. Violations in and of themselves, since they had the completely wrong subject in mind, the completely wrong Lord in mind. A golden Lord that can be bought and sold. What we also see here are a great many playtime offerings being made in our biblical text. That is, if you apply some sort of Granville Sharp construction to the Hebrew grammar. If you apply a copulative conjunction. to the Hebrew grammar. And, copulative, to play. And, set down. And. What? You don't like Strong's lexicon above? From my Bible Offline app? Okay. Here's your gold standard BDB then. Work your way through that one. So now, that very form of playtime should become a little more evident, clear to you. Quite clear from that Genesis 26:8 reference above, especially. So no, those offerings were not that alternate gloss of number one. Not mere laughing or jesting, but rather they involved caressing, conjugal caressing to be more specific. And gloss number 2. And this smelter structure is certainly large enough for those playtime caresses too. A platform large enough for fertility offerings of a copulative sort, of a conjugal sort to be specific, with that calf looking on as a bovine voyeur, presumably looking upon you with some sort of glee, eyeing your performance with good intent. Playtime offerings performed in order to plead for a savior, to plead for a leader to replace their MIA Moses, who had been missing in action for more than a month, for a divine savior to lead them out of this miserable wilderness, this miserable place. Playtime offerings not unlike Wicca's third degree ceremony, where public intercourse is a rite of order in order to invoke some sort of union with the divine, in order to invoke a sympathetic hearing. Silly Wicca. And those brazen stand-up offerings, also recounted in 1 Corinthians 10:8, are therein recounted as being immoral, since that much later culture fully understood the euphemism being used in our Exodus text. They fully understand the playtime context, fully understood the illicit sex involved. 1 Corinthians 10:8. Mede Arneomen. Mede Arneomen. Those were largely stand-up sexual offerings being made, but offerings being made with those other than their spouses. Offerings made in broad daylight, invoking the bull god Apis for a sympathetic hearing, or invoking the goddess Hathor, depending on your gender allegiance. Allegedly stand-up offerings being made there immediately following a wholesome breakfast, a meat and manna breakfast. Offerings which are typically made to your spouse in the dark. Yet the immediate context places these stand-up offerings in broad daylight, in stark contrast with the euphemistic eating and drinking while lying down. So there you have that mysterious euphemism of Exodus being clarified and validated by that adjacent text, as well as being clarified by that Genesis text of Isaac caressing Rebekah, and later being clarified by that Corinthians text. However, that caressing is not the actual violation in question, nor is simply standing in front of other gods an actual violation. Yes, you can reference that in the previous article. And even the making of that carved image was not the actual violation, nor was the building of an alternative altar the actual violation, but rather the bowing down and serving was the actual violation. Our Bible text. Now, first off, we should be mindful that verses 4 and 5, aligned above, are not two separate commandments. No, verse 5 is is a natural progression of verse 4, showing the natural evolution of verse 4. The evolution of making in order to worship. With verse 5b being a clausal statement, since it includes the because element, since it includes the operative element, includes the operative God. An element rightfully separated by a semicolon, though wrongfully running past the nominative, running right past the jealous God element. A bit of a run-on sentence there. In much the same way, verse 4 is definitely not a run-on of verse 3. No, those are totally separate commandments. Those verses are asymmetrical and acontextual. Despite all of that, there is a little symmetry there. Some symmetry in that verse. Since 5b does apply to both commandments. It applies since God is rightfully jealous for singular as well as for true worship. Any other worship? Patently false. But more so, asymmetrical, since the making of images is an external reality, along with bowing down and serving them being an external reality, whereas the having of other gods before God is more of an internal reality, a heartfelt bowing down, a more deeply committed reality and sin. Now, to be perfectly inclusive, this commandment is speaking to the making of any images here, any image whatsoever, as opposed to Strong's narrow definition of making carved images. A bit of a synecdoche with the term pesel. Here is the term pesel in our Hebrew, with Strong's calling it a carved image. But we actually have a more inclusive dictate that would have painted images on an easel included in it as well. That would include any and all images imaginable, since the because element demonstrates the larger scope, demonstrates the wider prohibition. So the making of sculptures, stained glass, photographs, holograms, and even more so VR and robots could also fall under that widespread pesel category, could fall under that very same external reality, could fall under that false reality, could fall under the broad category of bowing down or serving those images in some slavish manner, whether they be angels or not, whether they be saints or not, whether they be porn or not. To further illustrate this prohibition, there is the constant quibbling over whether the ancient Latin translation of this verse includes the modern day dulia, includes the dulia granted to Mary, for instance. And here the Latin dictionary is not so helpful to the Roman Catholic case. No, not so helpful. What? You don't like the Latin now either? Well then, here's good old BDB again. Here's your gold standard Hebrew. Says pretty much the same thing, huh? Well. Yes, this is a Good old BDB. But of course, those glosses above are not entirely accurate either, since that bowing down and serving parenthetic is specifically in reference to those idols, rather than referring to those other gods glossed above. Other gods glossed in number 3 there. A mere hypothetical already discredited in the first commandment, discredited in our earlier article. So, this commandment is strictly in reference to bowing down and serving those physical images rather than some spacey mental images, physical images that can intrude into the mental. Dangerous images God commanded to be broken. Just as the parallel imperative clearly states to physically break down their pillars in Exodus 23:24. A very clear picture of breaking physical pillars into pieces now. What various judges of Israel were commended for. Not unlike what we demonstrated in our previous article, with a contemporary pictograph of Moses breaking those commandment pillars, with that abundantly clear pillar logogram being used exactly where they were physically broken. Since a bowing before physical images will indeed intrude into our mental images, and a physical serving that will indeed confuse and conflate those mental images of ours. Confuse them as to bowing before an actual God. Now, as a bit of a test case, the bowing and serving that Daniel and his buddies outright refused to do. Refused to do to an image under the auspices that this was a god, and a golden god at that. Let's give you a little bit of history then. Now, to start off this shameful history, this legendary golden calf altar was actually discovered not all that long ago. Discovered by the controversial Ron Wyatt back in 1984. Discovered in a clandestine sort of way by an illegal border crossing into Saudi Arabia at a time when tourists were not welcome at all. A discovery which resulted in this unknown altar immediately being fenced off to the general public and Wyatt being imprisoned for a couple of months. Immediately fenced off in order to preserve and conserve those rich artifacts of presumably Arabic history. Or, for all you conspiracy theorists out there, fenced off in order that the 15th century invasion of their country by the sons of Israel might be hidden once again. After all, this present land belonged to the present sons of Ishmael instead. And so those squatters' rights were but to be conceded to his younger infidel brother. Certainly not now, just as Israel does not concede any land claims to Palestinian squatters. Well, not for the past 75 years anyways. However, despite that properly protective fencing, this simply incredible discovery cannot be hidden anymore. Since God has finally seen fit to reveal this amazing biblical confirmation via YouTube or whatever. And as a result, I won't be hiding my thoughts on this golden calf either. That would be a waste of a perfectly good calling, if you call that a viable calling. Now, you might even say that this rambling golden calf treatise was fashioned in order for me to work out some of the PTSD experience of that location. Yet this is a post-traumatic cyanide disorder that I am eternally grateful for, and that I hope to never minimize. And neither should you ever decide to go there. Should you ever decide to worship there. in spirit and in truth. Having said all that, below is a photo of the large elevated platform of that golden calf altar, or rather, the top of that golden calf smelter, with me on its top. Large enough for a pretty lit tailgate party, huh? Or a dance floor. But more so, large enough for an enormous party surrounding it. A party larger than any Parliament Hill or Capitol Hill coup. Let's just call it the Exodus coup, shall we? But a party in which the people would stand up in order to play. How is that for an obscure descriptive? And based on the iconography found in and around that altar, I don't think they were playing ball there at all. But it certainly seems they were having ball, much like the scriptures suggest. And to that ballroom end, it would be more than fair to say that there were well over 3,000 idol worshippers present there. Well over 3,000 at this golden ball, despite only 3,000 of the insurrectionist element being summarily executed by their brothers. And even then, only executing the men of the people at that, since men ought to know better than that, are supposed to be the priests and protectors of their diminutive women. Now, with respect to those numbers, I believe that the Catholic DRA saying 23,000 naked offenders were executed is completely wrong. I don't think there were near that many executed at that time. I think the Latin Vulgate conflated that number with a plague that was to occur a short time later, with God taking care of those remaining insurrectionists a little more directly, taking care of those disenfranchised women as well. And that immediate number might even be ascertained by counting the memorial stones in the nearby graveyard. A graveyard just a short way down that dry and dusty lane. Anonymous memorial stones in the presently fenced-off graveyard, about 4 miles to the north. A graveyard that may even contain some more golden earrings. And no, I do not think that those select 3,000 were some disenfranchised gay contingent of Israel either, as some historical revisionists from Tel Aviv might extrapolate. No, not gay guys doing some stand-up routine. A comedy of errors there. No, this execution was purely about idolatry and not about their perversion. It was all about the calf and not about their calves. Still, it was a vocal contingent large enough to intimidate Aaron, to intimidate the very brother of Moses, who was not the least bit intimidated by powerful Egyptians just a short time earlier. The dance floor. But getting back on track, the above image is of our fellow adventurers Ben Parsons and Joseph Jim. Not playing around, but just standing on the platform proper, on the ballroom floor, with the mountain in the background being a good few football fields away to the south, with that lesser hill to the left being less than a soccer pitch away. But most importantly, this idolatrous altar was only about 1,000 yards from the base of a really serious hill called Mount Sinai, a hill that they were quite understandably terrified of at the time. A hill getting ready to erupt, perhaps. A hill where there was tremendous smoke and fire, thunder and lightning, blaring trumpets, and even earth quaking. A hill manifesting mega violence just a few miles away from where they pitched their tents. A hill likely causing mass unrest and sleeplessness for more than a month. Mass unrest precipitating this altar of fear to be fashioned, perhaps. But that's just making excuses for them, huh? Yet, to be perfectly fair to those calf people, this altar was fashioned just before the Ten Commandments were formally passed down. Fashioned just before those commands against idolatry were smashed right in front of the faces of those stiff-necked sons of Israel. Thrown down around 600 yards away from this altar of desperation. An event that I shared in my Pictograph at Mount Sinai article. Commandments that were thereafter repeated and later expanded upon, along with numerous supplementary rules regarding proper sacrificial procedure. Proper sacrificial procedure to be made to an incredibly faithful and jealous God. Proper sacrifices to a God who did not and would not abandon those Hebrews in the previous 60 days, even though they were worthy of abandonment. And a God who would by no means abandon them during the time that he spoke with Moses privately, spoke with him at the summit, spoke with Moses about constructing a bigger and better altar, among other things, because he knew they would definitely need it. Now, in order to get some perspective on those two altars in question, here is a recent Google Earth map of their relative locations. Note the blue pins of the golden calf altar on the right and the blue pin to the far left of the Moses altar. Not terribly far from each other. So, from that wonderful map above, you may see the slightly deconstructed golden calf altar to the east and the slightly deconstructed altar of Moses to the west. One altar at a mountain with a stream running down it, and the other at a hill with crackpots surrounding it. But this treatise is to look at the golden calf construction more specifically, to look at their creation of that specific idol, to look at their resourceful representation and reinterpretation of the popular bull god Apis. A bull god very popular with the Egyptians of the day. Yet this is their Hebrew reinterpretation of that bull, an exclusive interpretation with stripes at this point in time, but more likely engraved with just one primal stripe in order to represent that classic animal husbandry of their ancestor Jacob. An ownership stripe that is discussed more fully in my Petroglyph panel article. But almost certainly a male calf. Male, since this Hebrew is traditionally a masculine singular, is traditionally a masculine nominative, even though that sexist nominative sounds an awful lot like egal, as in egalitarian. A calf that identified as bovine rather than as equine, though he could have been a horse, of course. It all depends on how he was feeling that day, right? Yet, a representation made of gold to get a really good gleam on. A clean machine gleam. A gleam that would need no painstaking polishing. A good evening gleam as they left that fabrication, as they finished their fabrication at sunset, with the dying embers of that smelting fire flickering off that gleam machine. An evening filled with great hope and great visions. Yes, it was the night before mayhem, and all through the camp. And then a good morning gleam as they came upon that image at sunrise. Came upon it early with fresh ideas. Came upon it early to offer sacrifices to it. With the sunrise dancing squarely off of its butt, and then hotly coming to rest on its face at high noon. A golden calf formed from the mold shown below. A form deeply recessed into the top of this platform and wide enough to swallow gold with nary a burp. To swallow this author, wide enough, deep enough to have a bath in. But to swallow precious gold, such as their not so precious earrings which may have identified them as Egyptian slaves, right along with other gold items that were recently unloaded on the men, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, unloaded by the Egyptians just as they were leaving. A very hurried peace offering of sorts, a tacit appeal for their sympathetic prayers to a God that had judged them justly, to a God that had just killed their firstborn. But to that forming end, Aaron would not be entirely wrong in claiming that he did not fashion this idolatrous calf, that he merely solicited their filthy gold and then tossed it into that ceramic cauldron and later engraved it with his graving tool. That he merely poured those golden offerings into the form that others had fashioned. And this beastly thing just so happened to pop out. Popped out twice, as you will see. But we also know the rest of the story. That even though Aaron may not have chiseled out the form, that he was totally complicit. Guilty in the first degree, but likely not executed, since he did not sacrifice to it. He did not bow down and serve it, unlike at least 3,000 others. Now, to that chiseling end, this does not appear to be normal wear and tear of that sandstone top, and not normal cracking either. Instead, this is a form that appears to have been chiseled quite extensively into a highly symmetrical form, filling in the extraneous chiseling with some form of plaster for each molten pore. Chiseled even to the point of cracking this massive boulder. Not only that, but this form appears to have been prepared for an eye implant, for what appears to be a highly symmetrical eye in the foreground as well as in the background. An eye that was prepared separately. No, this eye was not drilled by a worm or a woodpecker, folks. This was totally intentional and time-consuming. The eye, which is the bane of evolution, with perhaps the semblance of a nostril chiseled out as well. All the better to smell you with, right? Along with ears to hear you with, right? Yet symmetrical in order to make a left side as well as a right side, a recto with a versa in a subsequent pore, with the two pores being held together with a cinch or a girth that simulated that Jacobite stripe, that proud Jacobite stripe, with that all-seeing eye then being implanted with acacia gum from the many surrounding acacia trees, with a tail tacked on for good measure. It wouldn't be a bull without a tail to tell now, would it? And here we see some of those features. The eye, possibly the nostril, possibly horns. So in the above redaction, we have the reasonable facsimile of a calf, correct? Please pardon my pathetic paint skills. And not only that, but we also have the prototype on this platform as well. What? Yes, a smaller model that the mold makers were not completely satisfied with. What? Another symmetrical prototype that Ben appears to be taking a photo of. An abandoned mold at the very edge of the smelter vent. A little too close to the heat, I would imagine, and too small to suit the masses. Yet, how could they forge such a massive beast, you ask? Where did they get the tools and technology for such a serious smelter? Let alone get the PPE? Since we all know that a forge takes an awful lot of heat and sheds an awful lot of heat. Around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in order to smelt down your precious gold. Something in the order of the fires of Mordor, right? Yeah, no dragons were available at the time, so they had to do it the hard way. So, to that fiery end, we know that there continues to be lots of rugged acacia and almond trees in that region. Lots of fuel for the fire, so to speak. After all, it's not called the Mountain of Almonds, Jalalas, by the native for nothing. And of course, there's plenty of volatile brush there as well. A volatility accelerated by the extreme heat of that place. And fanning that fuel to an adequate smelting flame would not be all that hard. Certainly not when you had the fans of random palm trees at your disposal. Fans that they might have scooped from Elam just a short time earlier. Not only that, but the evening katabatic wind from the mountain wouldn't hurt their cause either. We have shown that phenomenon in that earlier article. A natural fanning action that would then have occurred at the very crevice of our above photo. A most convenient crevice, about 10 foot high, 10 foot long, right along with a great place to stand to feed the fuel. Just take it from someone who has been an oil burner, gas burner, an alternative fuel technician for over 40 years. It's really not that hard to generate that sort of heat. Even a little butane torch will melt gold quite readily. No propane or MAP gas required. Plus, they likely carried charcoal with them to encourage and sustain that incredible heat. Charcoal that they used to cook the manna and quail. And perhaps cook a camel or two. Charcoal that was light, compact, and quite popular in those days. Popular since it was smokeless. And nobody likes doing laundry. Or sending sparks on nearby tents. Smokeless since much of the wood moisture had already been removed. Removed via an anaerobic combustion chamber. a chamber with very tight air regulation, and an aerobic chamber that remains there to this very day. What? As you may see in this YouTube link below. Yeah, notice the large vent at the feet of Ben and Joseph in that earlier photo. Notice that large vent. Did you notice the rock discoloration there? No? Those are not late day shadows on those rocks, folks. Like some 5 o'clock shadows. Oh, it's 5 o'clock. Imagine that. On manly faces. Nor is that a desert varnish. No, that mysterious varnish doesn't grow on rocks like that. Not that thick. And it certainly doesn't spall like that either. I often encounter high temperature refractory discolored like that. Encounter that spalling and replace it in a great many combustion chambers. And that's what it happens to look like. Like it or not. And here we have exactly that. A prime crevice leading to a prime combustion chamber with some pretty serious venting to complete the equation. Prime components for a pretty serious burn, and a really, really hot burn at that, for a really focused burn. The molten gold would then be passed on to Aaron to perform his priestly duties. Passed on to him in some sort of cauldron, ceramic cauldron as I mentioned earlier, a ceramic crucible moved laterally along this makeshift dance floor via thick poles or rollers perhaps, for him to tip that crucible into that hungry and well-crafted form. To form the one that might possibly save them from their misery. Now, what sort of PPE did they have at the time? Personal protective equipment? Well, lots of leather, I'm guessing. After all, my leather welding gloves taken off a lot of punishment, especially if you double them up. No asbestos required. Now, what exactly they did for eye protection? Still got me puzzled though. Perhaps a thin leather veil. Though I certainly wouldn't use that for welding or smelting. Our Canadian snow can be blinding enough. So, the tools and technology were definitely there, right along with the crude form and fuel. And the even cruder will. A bit of a stand-up will. Conclusion. Now, my closing question for you is this. Do we have that very same idolatrous will, that very same idolatrous propensity in good times and in bad? Not to fashion a calf, perhaps, but what about the myriad of our other idols? Those countless other realities of ours, those realities we dismiss as mere dulia, that we dismiss as mere reverence, as hyper as that reverence may be. Or can we be fully content with Jesus instead? Fully content with that Christ of Christmas? The one who created this reality of ours, who created this hyper reality. Pretty tough ask, huh? Yeah, pretty tough task at that. Really, really tough, since we humans are so desperately wicked. Wicked from the inside out. Wicked from the time of Adam. Wicked from the day we were born. Indeed, we so desperately need a Savior. So desperately need a Holy Spirit from the Holy Spirit. And our idols are nothing. Less than nothing. Worse than nothing. Hang in there, y'all. Cheers.